I was going to say, so then if we see notes with a bunch of Z's in them, we'll know what happened.
All right, it's 11:30. I think we have a pretty good quorum. Yeah, well, 11:30 where I am. I don't know what time it is where you are, but it looks like we have a good quorum of folks. So this is TLS Working Group meeting. This session is, of course, being recorded. Since you're on this call, you probably have already figured out all of the things you need to do, but it's good to mute when you're not talking. Let's see. Note well. You should all be familiar with Note well, especially if you've been to an IETF meeting before. Whoops, I left presenter mode. Okay, we're getting there. So here we are. This is Joe and Chris and Sean are also chairing, and we have not a whole lot of things to talk about today, but we do have a note taker. I think we can probably handle Jabber, but if somebody wants to relay messages from Jabber, that would be appreciated as well. We have a couple topics aside from just kind of status. One is some issues that were related to DTLS connection ID, and then of course our favorite topic is encrypted client hello. And then we'll talk about interrupt targets as a means to get more implementation of our drafts. Sean, did you want to talk about status?
Yes. So, well, that's interesting. That's the old version. In any event, we have a bunch of drafts that are in. Let me see if I can share my slide. Publish screen. Blink. Are you guys seeing this slide?
See Joe's.
You see Joe's. All right. Well, those are the old ones. In any event, we have a bunch of drafts that have progressed forward. We published RC 8744, which is the requirements for SNI encryption in TLS. We have a document with the RC editor that's been there for quite some time called TLS certificate compression. There's a problem with it. Yeah, there we go. There's a problem is that there's a reference to the Z standard draft or compression algorithm that Facebook uses. There was an old RFC and they're updating it. They have a BIS. And it got all the way through the process and it was sitting in the RC editor's queue. And then I just recently found out that it's getting pulled back to the ISG. So the question is, should we just refer to the old version and let the update/obsoletes mechanism that the RC editor has kind of do its thing? Ben, you got any feeling on this?
Yeah, hi, Ben Kadek, the AD for TLS. I think we should just stop referencing the BIS. The particular change with the Z standard draft that they have to deal with is a kind of gnarly one. And so I don't expect to have a final resolution to that particularly soon.
And I don't think anybody's going to have any particular heartburn since this was actually, this reference was introduced by me. So I'm hoping that we can just allow let the publication process just do its thing and we can get to the end and update it. So unless we hear anybody screaming very shortly, we're going to go ahead and tell the RC editor that they can point the reference to the old document.
Sounds good.
All right, great. We got three other documents that have been through IETF last call that have some updates that need to be done. The authors are working on them. I've been providing some inputs as well as some of the other shepherds. Right now we have deprecating TLS 1.0 and 1.1 in IETF last call. And then we have 3 other documents that were in AD eval. And we got to provide some revise them based on the comments. I know that Ecker is jumping on the DTLS protocol edits, and we're going to talk about the connection identifiers. And Chris has ticket requests in hand, but we're not going to talk about it today. And then we have a bunch of other drafts that are obviously active. So we only have a 1 hour slot. We're not going to talk about much. The other ones really only encrypted client hello. And I think that's really it. And I think now we're going to pass it over to Ecker.
Yeah, so actually I wanted to say something about briefly at the DTLS AD comments as well. I started going through them. I've read all of them, and I've sort of like writing responses and figuring out what to do. I think there's only a couple points that should be at all contentious, and I think that the outcomes are pretty straightforward there. So thanks, Ben, for the detailed reviews. I'm hoping to have responses and sort of NPRs and stuff next week. So hopefully we can get that out quickly. I think Ben identified like one actual defect that I think we need to fix. Okay. So yes, so I guess the details connection ID. So in Ben's AD review, he identified an issue with the way that we form the MACs for GTLS connection IDs. Next slide. No, too far ahead. Go back. There we go. So basically the issue. So this is the MAC construction for MAC that encrypt. So you take the MAC with a MAC write key and some crap, and then the connection ID plus the connection ID length plus the length of the remaining stuff plus some other stuff. So it doesn't really matter what the things the dots are. But the key point here is that the CID length is known internally, known externally from the handshake negotiation, but it's encoded after the CID, not before. And the reason we did it that way, well, it doesn't really matter. We did it that way. And the point here is this is not an injective mapping. And so basically there are two, depending on what the rest of the fields are like, you can have like two CIDs of different lengths that both encode validly in the structure. So in the example, I was pretty late when I did this, but the bytes 0101 0203, if the receiver thinks the CID is 1 byte long, and this looks like a 1 byte CID with a 1 byte length length of 1, and then a packet length of OX200, and then a payload that starts at 03. But if you think there's a 2 byte CID, then this also looks valid, and you end up with a different thing. And so basically, this lets you. There's potential for confusion about the boundary between the CID and the plaintext. And this is because basically the combination of this particular encoding and the fact that the MAC just concatenates everything together instead of having it separated in some way. Say Ben pointed this out during the review. Next slide. Sorry, I'm getting distracted by watching the chat. Okay, so it's not really clear what the impact of this is. No one can figure out anything particularly great with it. The finished messages do cover the CID exchange, so an on-path attacker can't just like screw the CIDs and cause this to affect the application data, but you can affect the CID that's using the record containing the finished, which again is not clear what you can do with that, but it doesn't seem awesome. And the whole thing just generally seems kind of gross and makes the protocol hard to reason about. So we should probably fix it, and it doesn't really cost us anything to fix it. Note that this shouldn't be, as I understand, an issue for TLS 1.3 because there's only one variable length field, which is the CID, and that goes at the end, and everything else is fixed length, and the AAD. This is the AAD, so it's not concatenated with the rest of the MAC, with the rest of the data from the MAC. So basically, next slide. So roughly speaking, the natural fix is to put the length of the CID before the CID in the packet. But unfortunately, if you just do, when we designed a bunch of these structures, we were trying to balance a bunch of things, and one of the things we were trying to balance was to integrity check the thing that actually appears in the wire to the greatest extent possible, rather than having integrity check some reconstruction of the thing that appeared in the wire. And so if you just put the CID length like somewhere earlier, then you have other points of confusion. And so we cooked up this kind of bogus structure where the first byte is this marker byte, that's the TLS 1.2 CID, And that since that only can, because that would ordinarily be the content type, and so that content can only appear in this structure, and therefore there's no confusion between this and like other content types. And so when you have the TLS 4.2 CID content type, then the next thing you have is the CID length, and then you have the actual content type, because that allows you to have the headers appear from the wire concatenated together, as you can see from this diagram. And then you have length of plain text, and then you have the plain text itself. So this kind of basically preserves the invariance of A, it's injective, we think, and B, it has the headers appear from the wire glued onto the glued into the Mac. We can do similar things for AED and the method encrypt mode. The method encrypt mode looks pretty ugly. I don't know. Okay, I shouldn't have said method encrypt the Mac, not method encrypt. As I said, I did these slides about an hour ago. But you can do a similar structure for them as well, though the encrypt the Mac looks kind of gross. Next slide. So I appreciate that this is not like the world's greatest attack, but I think that given that we don't have like a lot of installed base here, I think it'd be better to actually build something which is easier to reason about than to have to make a bunch of reasoning about, well, this only seems to apply before finished, and so like we're not worried about it, which is sort of the place we are now. So like if we were like at auth38 or like later, you might not patch this, but given that like it's just a matter of changing small pieces of code, I think this is worth doing. So I guess there's stuff in the list basically describes all three variants. So really the question is, anybody object to this? And if so, let's hear about it. I know Akeem Kraus is not excited about it, but I don't see him on the chat. So I guess after we're done with this discussion, I'm going to ask the chairs to do a hum, because like I'd like to get this nailed down rather than have it be sort of like in some limbo state.
Yeah, just to pop in again, this is Ben Kadek. Not an objection, but a question would be if we think that we need to get a new code point for the extension.
I don't know if I'm not aware of anybody deploying this in the wild, though maybe Hannes knows better. So I guess I would ask. I think is Hannes on this call? Yeah, maybe somebody knows. I don't know. We certainly have not deployed this in the wild.
He just jumped in the queue.
Fantastic.
So I think all you have to do is unmute yourself, Hannes.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, okay. Yeah. This is deployed, but I don't think it will cause any problems, because in those deployments it's very isolated. So I think it's not an issue. In general, what I'm a little bit unhappy is with these type of changes is that we had these discussions on the way how we construct the additional data, and in general the whole Mac construction in the past several times, and changed the document numerous times. And that was mostly because there was always some perceived issue which wasn't really precisely an attack, but we couldn't actually have someone to do a formal analysis either, because for whatever reason, several people said that they would do so, but I've never seen any outcome of it. And in the long run, I think it would be interesting to know what type of constructions are more secure than others. But so currently it appears that it's more a preference rather than a style, rather than anything else. But I have no objection to make that change.
So I guess if we're going to do a poll, this is going to be a simple one. This is going to be object, raise your hand, or don't object, leave your hand down. Is that what you're going for, Eric?
That would be fine.
You're muted.
Well, am I muted?
Not anymore.
Okay, because I like level meters. That would be a fine hum. I I guess you have to decide, but which way, whether hand up is good or hand up is down. I'm just looking for like enough of a consensus that we should do this, and I can go ahead and do a PR and get it done.
All right. I've not used this poll, but let's see. Title. TLS ID change. So what we're going to have is start. So raise your hand if you would like to. Raise the hand if you have any objections. Don't raise your hand if you don't have any objections. I'll let it go for another little while.
This is DKG. Can I just remind folks that there is a deliberate option that is do not raise your hand. So if you are participating in the meeting, you can go and you can click do not raise your hand, and that makes it explicit rather than just we can't
Absolutely.
tell whether you actually
Yeah, you can't see this, but that's basically what everybody's doing. So at the end, you'll see the end of the poll results. So I'll give it another 30 seconds.
I see you're still finding more ballots there, Sean.
Yeah, we can see it, Sean.
Well, you can see it. Okay, good. We'll have to make sure these are legal. All right. In 10 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. All right. So it looks like it's pretty clear here what we're going to do. So I guess we're going to go ahead and make the change.
I'll effectuate that.
Excellent, sir. Now we are going on to the ECH show.
Right. So we'll start with there's a couple open PRs as well as some open issues. What I'd like to do now is quickly go through some of the PRs that I think have reached some sort of consensus, at least on the discussion, see if we can get agreement on them, land them, and then have a discussion about HR and potentially what we want to do for draft 9 and the interrupt target. So I don't know if Sean or Joe, which one of you is driving, but if you could go to PR 353. Right. So this is a change basically to bind more of the handshake to the accept confirmation signal. Previously, it was just something that was exported from the HPKey context, I believe. I actually don't remember the details before, and shoved in the last couple bytes of the server hello random. Whereas now, with this proposed change, it basically outputs something from the handshake secret and shoves that into the handshake or into the last 8 bytes of the server hello random, basically binding as much as we possibly can. And this is, something that Christian pointed out with a pretty simple remedy. It turns out that it's fairly straightforward to implement. And it seems like this is pretty low-hanging fruit, and we should just do it. Though I'd like to hear from people whether or not they disagree with the change.
All right, Ecker, you're up.
Yeah, I don't think we need to. Oh, sorry, someone in the queue.
Yeah, did you just want me to go hot mic there? I thought I'd wait in the queue politely.
Yeah.
So I do agree with this change. I think the TLS philosophy appears to be like belt suspenders and also like some duct tape, and so like doing that here I think is advisable. That said, I think we're gonna as you talk about the next, I guess that there's agreeing with the change, and then there's agreeing, and then there's having a coherent threat model that motivates the change. And I think we're going to find, as we talk about the next couple of PRs, that our threat model is not exactly as clear as you hope for, especially when we include HR. So, I think we're going to have to ask the question: is the attack that this is intended to prevent actually like in scope, even if we make the change?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. This is it's not clear to me in the do not stick out goals whether or not this is actually something useful, or this actually plugs something that the sort of attacker we seem to have cared about could do otherwise. Though this does seem to follow the pattern of ECH, wherein like we thought previously we bound enough, but we found out that we didn't do so. So I think that's the motivation here. So I basically agree with what you said. There was an issue that Chris Patton filed. Raising sort of the larger threat model discussion on, what is our definition of do not stick out. And I think that's going to require some more discussion well beyond what we have time for today. So probably table that for an interim or something after this meeting is adjourned. So I guess if there's no objections, I'd like to propose we just land this and move forward, and then address the larger threat model discussion, again, in the context of the separate issue. Cool.
I think that's a make it so.
All right. Can you move to 352? So this change fixes somewhat of an annoying part of the spec, wherein in the event of HRR, we found due to various reaction attacks that we needed to bind client hello 1 to client hello 2. How we chose to do that previously was to basically thread a PSK exported from client hello 1's encryption into the encryption of client hello 2. This has a couple of knock-on effects in that it requires 2 HPKey, effectively in-cap and decap operations, thus like raising a potential edge case on server-side queue rotation, which is somewhat of a pain. It's also more expensive, obviously, and HPKey though has this nice property wherein you can reuse context from more than one encryption. If you encrypt a plain text once internally, the HPKey context just bumps in a sequence number or nonce, and then uses a completely different nonce for the next encryption. So what this change proposes is to basically replace PSK-based binding with context reuse, wherein they're bound together by the same HPKey context. You only do one in a Diffie-Hellman like chem, one Diffie-Hellman operation, even in the event of HRR for determining ECH, and removes a lot of complexity, which is quite nice. It removes the server-side edge case, which is also quite nice. I don't know, Chris, or David, if there's anything else you'd like to say in support of this change. I think that pretty much sums it up. I saw Chris join and then pop out. Eric, you can go if you have something.
You guys can't throw me out. I think I'm the queue from last time.
Oh, all right.
But since I'm here,
this tool is great.
Since I'm here, I guess I'm okay with this.
Okay. Chris or David, would you like to say anything more?
I think you summed it up nicely. It simplifies the picture. It's not clear that it doesn't impact security. So I think it's a clear win.
You have anything to add either?
Okay. I guess hearing none, I guess we'll go ahead and push this one forward as well. Before we move on to sort of, well, actually, let's go to the next contentious PR. Sean, can you go to 316?
Currently running the show, and he's showing us some TEEP stuff.
That's all right. Right. So while this one loads, this was sort of a quick patch to work around a sort of massive cliff in the spec, wherein if client hello one or inner and outer had different key shares and the server sent an HRR in response, clients are sort of potentially in an awkward position in determining, how they should actually generate their second client hello. The remedy here, or the quick fix here, was to simply just require that any sort of what we call HR sensitive parameter in client hello, inner or outer, matches. So things like key shares and whatnot, such that the client doesn't have to make this determination upon HRR or have to do any sort of figuring out what the server actually intended in the event of HRR. Now, on the thread, there have been discussion about potentially other ways for servers to signal this. For example, like what if we did the HRR accept like PRF trick, where we shove some bytes into the server hello random to determine whether or not HRR was sent and ECH was accepted or not. I think in the absence of seeing something more flushed out, and in the interest of getting something that at least avoids this implementation issue for an interoperable draft, I'd like to propose that we take this PR sort of as is, flag an open issue in that this might not be the final way we deal with this particular point. We may choose to do the PRF-like thing or something else, whatever. And just merge this so we can implement something that is, deployable sort of at a larger scale. This is a discussion about this particular issue, as Ecker pointed out earlier, sort of calls into question, again, the do not stick out threat model and what we're actually trying to hide or not in the event of HRR. We don't really have sort of a clearly written down end goal or success criteria there. Although I think in discussions with various people, it seems that hiding anything or making sure we do not stick out in the event of HRR is sort of futile. So perhaps we don't need to do anything special here. But I think that's all there is to say about this particular one. So just to recap, I think the proposal is make sure they match, flag an open issue for further discussion, and address after 09 ships. I'd like to hear what other people think. So there is some discussion in the chat.
So Ecker, you managed to get in the queue first.
Oh, go for it.
To not be in the queue first, because I wanted to hear what other people thought. But since I'm here, I guess I'm actually quite skeptical about this is the right design, but I understand. I think that Chris's point, which I agree with, is it'd be good to get we've made enough changes, it'd be good to get some interop testing done, and that this question does not affect whether or not we can test the thing, as far as I can tell, and doesn't affect whether we can make sure it actually works in scale. So I think it's worth trying to get this done now, but leaving the open issue marker in. Those to say, I'm not sure this is the right actual outcome.
Thanks. Jonathan?
Just to re-ask a question I asked in chat, which I want to know the answer to. Does this make it easier to fingerprint the client because they have to send some parameters in clear text, effectively?
I think you're pointing to the do not stack out issue. Can you mute your speakers also?
Oh, sorry.
That's all right. I'll just revoke audio. Yeah, this points to the larger do not stake out threat model. And there's lots of ways that HR already kind of sticks out. in ECH acceptance. So I'm not really sure that it's an issue, but I could be misunderstanding the problem. And I also took away your audio, so you'd have to reshare if you want to say something else.
Sorry, yeah, I was just thinking. I was actually thinking more about like, could I derive what TLS stack somebody was using based on the outer parameter choices, and which are now clear text parameter choices?
Oh. I'm revoking again. I mean, that's already an issue today, I think, in practice. I don't know if TLS stack fingerprinting is something we're trying to address. In my view, it's sort of strictly out of scope. Although, I mean, I don't think the question has ever been really raised in this particular context for ETH. So, yeah, I mean, if someone else has an opinion, I'd be curious to hear it.
Thanks.
Yep. So I guess just following the chat. Yeah, I mean, you can already fingerprint the stack. So, I mean, we could potentially note it in security considerations or something, but again, I'm not sure it's new. So, I mean, Jonathan, if you want to draw up some text to that effect, that would be useful, I think. All right. So I guess hearing no objections, proceed with the open issue. Move this forward just to get something that's implementable and interoperable for 09. Which is good. Now we can kind of go over to the easy ones. So if you pop over to the issues, these are some changes that don't actually have text behind them yet, but I think they would be useful to at least get consensus on whether or not, or get a rough idea as to whether or not we want to include them in the next version of the draft. So 348 first, please. David filed this issue going through the draft due to lack of clarity in how servers actually deal with ECH extensions and not. And after various editorial changes, we finally got down to the sort of crux of the clarification, which was that there's a single heavyweight extension that does two things in two different contexts. That is the ECH extension. If it's in the outer client hello, it does one thing. If it's in the inner client hello, it does a different thing. So the proposal from David was to simply use two different extensions for these inner and outer client hellos. So Carrick thankfully put together, this one actually does have text, I'm sorry, Carrick. She put together text for this particular change. It effectively allocates a new code point for the inner client hello that has exactly the same functional semantics, more or less, as the current text. So I think this is pretty low-hanging fruit. It would be good to include in the next version. And I'd just like to pause here to see if people agree or disagree. Okay. I mean, this is sort of borderline editorial in a way, so, but there's no pushback, so. All right. If we could go now to 326. Right. So for a while, historically, the encryption of the client hello inner, it didn't actually have any additional authenticated data passed to HPKE, which was sort of an interesting design decision. But that has since been fixed. It now passes in basically the entirety with a small caveat of the outer client hello. thereby preventing malleability, like someone bit flipping, or changing cipher suites, dropping cipher suites, whatever, and seeing what changes. What it does not include in the additional authenticated data is what's called what we refer to as the ECH context, which is effectively things that are identifying or that the client-facing server needs to decrypt an ECH extension. So the encapsulated key that's output from HPKE, the config ID that corresponds to the config, and the cipher suite as well. Now this is like kind of similar to the DTLS CID issue that we just talked about. We don't, none of us really see like an actual problem that comes from this not being included in sort of the encryption context. But it just seems kind of gross that we have this one little special carve out for this particular data. So the proposal for this change here is to just pass everything that's everything you possibly can into additional authenticated data rather than doing it piecemeal. This does come at some implementation complexity, so we have to weigh that against potentially what are the benefits that we're getting. And as to reiterate, we're not actually sure of any attack it prevents. So and this is sort of greenfield as well. So yeah, Penny, for your thoughts. DKG asked, does this require fancy interconnection between the fronting server and the backend in split mode? No, I do not think it does, as Hacker points out. Primarily because the client-facing server, in decrypting the inner client hello, would just be changing what it passes in as additional authenticated data. It wouldn't actually change anything that passes to the backend server. All right. Yeah, as David points out, this is kind of reminiscent of the PSK binder stuff that we had to go through. So I think perhaps a good path forward for this is to for someone to propose text, and if it's not too terrible and cumbersome, just land the change. Otherwise, perhaps reassess whether or not it's worth it. But in general, it seems like people are in favor of binding more rather than binding less. Cool. Okay, can we go back to 358 now? So David, since you are here and you love HRR, do you mind if I turn this over to you?
Sure. Well, I guess you asked if I mind, so which the answer is also sure. But I will. Oh my God, HRR. Yeah. So HRR involves sending a second client hello, and what you are allowed to change in that client hello is what you are allowed to change and what servers check ends up being kind of a mess. RFC 8446 says that if the server says a bunch of rules and approximately that if the server did not mention an extension in HRR, the client is not allowed to change it in the second client hello. And at least right now, ECH does not utter the ECH extension in HRR, which means we are not actually allowed to change the second client hello's encrypted client hello payload, which doesn't really work. I think this rule was probably a mistake because if you imagine a padding, like this rule basically means we can't add new padding extensions either, because a padding extension might want to change the size in between the two, but there's no sense in the server echoing the padding extension. We got a carve out for our existing padding extension, but there's, I guess 313 might end up adding a new padding extension. I started a probe of some servers, and as of 30 minutes ago, I finally found one that breaks if you change an extension it doesn't recognize. So I'm not sure what we want to do, but this is a headache.
I mean, I generally agree with David that this particular text in 8446 isn't quite right. I don't think the fix is just to remove that line. However, the difficulty here is that the intent of this rule was supposed to be that you can't change things you're not told to change. And so, like, for instance, you can't change key shares if the HR didn't include key shares. So that's the intent of the rule. And so we need to nuance what that actually means. But I think, so I'm not saying that the text in 8446 is correct, but I'm saying that we can't just like strike that line either. So we'll probably fix that. In some ways, it's a little more careful, but I think that you know, so I think we'll have to nuance that some. But I generally agree that, like, obviously we have to like relax the rule. Oh, sorry, Chris, Patton asked me to repeat the intent of the rule. The intent of the rule is that you're not supposed to change things that the server didn't tell you to change in HRR. And so and so for instance, say the server you know, sends you HRR and asks for a cookie because you're doing DTLS, but doesn't say key shares. You're not supposed to change the key shares. So you're not supposed to do that, obviously. So I think we're gonna have to find some way to get that text in. Martin points out in the chat that other possibility would be just to have the server send an ECH message in HRR, which, by the way, would also solve our problem of how to indicate what which HRR you were talking about. So that's another possibility. So we may have to relax the rule, but I think we're not quite ready to just write that text.
Ecker, before you go though, are you suggesting that we would make this fix in 8446 bis? And then have this document point to 8446 bis? Is that what you're talking about?
You know how excited I am by that kind of process stuff. So
right.
No, I think we should determine what it says and then then figure out where to put it. But like, as a practical matter, you know, first of all, I think it's actually a pretty real chance that 8446 bis will be out before for ECH, because, like, as far as I know, we're getting pretty close to, like, there aren't any real big changes. But even if that weren't true, I think we could just override whatever rule we need to do and then echo in 8446 bis.
Okay.
All right, so what's not clear to me right now is whether or not we actually want to address this for draft version 9, because I guess we could have gotten away with this for an implementation interrupt, probably not for the final RFC version. David?
There's one. Okay, I'm unmuted. There is unfortunately one like compatibility impact, which is that because it looks like LibreSSL will break if you change them on HRR. If you send Grease extensions, right now the spec says, oh, you just compute a new one because that's matches what you would normally do. And if a client does that in experimentation, they will break all LibreSSL. Well, they will break all LibreSSL TLS-13 servers that happen to trigger HRR. So if you predicted the wrong key share or something. And
Okay,
there may
so
be
minimally,
still running, but.
Okay, so minimally it seems like we should do whatever we can to not break LibreSSL.
Yeah, and if we decide, and it also means that if we decide to override this rule, which I think we probably the rule I think is wrong, but if we decide to override the rule, we'll probably need to think about the compatibility impacts of this. I think it's probably mostly fine because it's just the recovery flow and such, but yeah.
Okay. Well, in either case, I guess this one needs a little bit more thought, but we can hash it out on the issue. In general, it seems like what is currently there is not quite correct. So minimally, we need to do something. Let's just figure out what that is, something it is we need to do. All right. So can we go back to the issues, please? All right. So there's a couple other sort of big outstanding issues. We probably only have time for two of them. So I'd like to quickly just go to pop over 313. Yeah, sorry, that's a PR, not an issue. I apologize. Right. So this is a PR that's been out for a while now. It basically replaces the proposed record layer padding with handshake level padding, as we talked about, I believe, at one of the earlier interims. We have not yet landed this yet because there was some we hadn't yet reached consensus on whether or not this would be something best to do either in like encrypted extensions or do a handshake message or whatever. So the status of the PR is not yet final. However, what I think is important for us to sort of decide right now, especially as we're thinking about the next version of the draft, is whether or not this is something we'd like to address for larger interop experiments. I'll note that for the final end goal project, ideally, yes, we do have padding implemented, both on client and server to hide relevant metadata. But right now, it seems sufficient for clients to implement padding for 09 interoperability and to ignore sort of the more complicated server-side padding story. So my proposal would be to continue to keep this on ice until 09 ships, and then come back to this until we have more time really to talk about what is the right path forward. And I'd like to hear what people think about that particular plan. Chris?
It seems somewhat orthogonal to getting the thing actually like deployed and running. This is something that we're going to have to think about really carefully because there's potentially a lot of different things that impact the length of messages, things that we want to hide that are privacy sensitive. So we want to be really careful with this bit. Yeah,
and admittedly, this is we've been hyper-focused on the client-side padding story for a very long time. Sort of just kind of punting on the server-side certificate flight and everything else story. So I definitely agree that this is going to, if it's going to be correct and complete, it's going to require more careful thought. So yeah, I think we should just hold off. And
Chris,
if there's no objections.
Yeah, I mean, I would have thought if people really wanted to do this, they would have been burning the door down here, and nobody is. So I think your assessment is right. We put it on ice and try to figure it out later.
Okay, then I'd like to pop over to the last final issue, and this one is an issue, Joe. It's 354, I believe. Yeah. So actually, I'm going to turn this over to Chris, who has been thinking a tremendous amount about this particular problem, and I'll let him summarize the issue and plug it for people.
Yeah. Let me just open it up here. 1 second. Yeah. So we've been kind of collecting this long list of possible ways. Well, okay. So just for some background, the X specification kind of defines two protocol variants, which we'll call real ECH and greased ECH. So real ECH is the client offers ECH and the server either accepts or rejects it. And in greased ECH, the client sends a dummy extension that's made to look like the real ECH extension. And the hope here is that if networks treat these two different protocol variants the same, and greased ECH is deployable for some definition of deployable, then real ECH will be deployable too. Because ultimately what our don't stick out considerations are about are at the very least deployability. So I've been kind of trying to figure out, well, what does it mean for you know, real ECH to look like greased ECH? We've been kind of thinking of this as like an indistinguishability property, like the goal being, if real ECH is absolutely is computationally indistinguishable from greased ECH, that is, no adversary can in a reasonable amount of time tell which one is running, then of course it's not going to treat them differently. But indistinguishability is just too strong. We don't achieve it with these pairs of these two pairs of protocols. And if you look at the issue, there's this long list of attacks. One was the, you know, Christian's attack that we hope to dispense with the first PR we talked about. But there's a whole list of other things. So the question I think we need to answer is, so what do we mean when we say what is this property like that we're actually after? And it's something like, what we have to kind of figure out is, okay, what are the possible ways, what are the possible features of the bits on the wire that might trigger middle boxes to treat one type of traffic differently from the other? And so we thought of various things. There might be the sets of extensions that they appear to negotiate, the number of round trips that are made over once the connection is established, things like packet size or the number of packets, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know what the answer is here. I think we also, like, you know, we're talking about a problem that we don't know is a real problem. So I kind of, you know, I kind of wanted to, you know, the point of this issue is to start a discussion about what we mean, what do we mean when we say the words don't stick out, and how, you know, and how do we know if we've succeeded, if that makes sense. So that's my spiel.
Chris, and there's certainly a lot to unpack here, I think. And it touches on many of the things that we've talked about today. So I do think a sort of a longer discussion, longer than 8 minutes or less, actually, because we're kind of already over, is needed for this particular topic. So what I would propose we do is perhaps make this one of the, if not the main issue to discuss during the next interim. And give people some time to chew on this sort of relaxed threat model that you're proposing here. Something not quite as strict as indistinguishability, but perhaps indifferentiability between grease and real ECH. So, of course, if people have thoughts on this topic in the meantime, we would encourage you to, you know, raise them on the issue or bring them to the list. Because right now, a lot of the design decisions we're making sort of, it turns out that we don't all share the same mental model in terms of what don't stick out actually means, as evidenced by Christian's attack that he pointed out, as evidenced by other things that have happened and on the draft as of late. So this initial work that Chris laid out here is, you know, a path towards getting towards that shared mental model. And so, Chris, thank you for putting this all together. This is really good. If there's no, I mean, we don't really have time for discussion, unfortunately. But I would propose we do is probably have another interim sometime soon, talk about these things, talk about other things. And as for the issues and PRs that we just went through, land the PRs that are ready for landing with the amendments that we've discussed, propose PRs for the issues that we've agreed upon, land those as well, then cut 09 as soon as we can. And that sort of leads us into the next topic, which I'm gonna hand back to Sean to drive.
All right, so one of the issues that came up in our GitHub discussion on the mailing list was how implementers can figure out what they need to implement. And so we're going to try to steal what Quick did with their implementations and try to develop a methodology for defining what an implementation target is. And I stole this definition directly from a message that Mark Nottingham sent. So, what's an implementation target? It's an internet draft that the working group feels is suitable for implementers to write code to for the purposes of interoperability testing and gathering feedback. So basically, we'd like declare 09 as the implementation version. Now, what we could do, that's the goal, is always that we try to get a draft and go towards implementing that. But if we ever got in the special case where we wanted to add some functionality or take some away, we could do that with the PR mechanisms that we have in GitHub. Next slide. Right, so when do we need one? Well, obviously this is going to apply to all drafts because not all drafts have active implementations going on. But for ones where we do, and there are people that are trying to make sure that they can follow along, basically we're going to have multiple active implementations. And when would we do this? Well, obviously before a hackathon or an interop event would be a great time to do that. So next slide. One of the things I guess I want to make clear is that in declaring an implementation version, that doesn't mean that the draft is going to get frozen and no other work is going to get done. The implementers are going to kind of go off, and then I think that the working group can kind of keep doing its thing and working on the draft and adding things. We'll have to decide whether we land those or not and how we do all that stuff. But you can have an implementation version that's say 09, and then we iterate to 14, and then the next implementation version is 13 or 15 or something like that. We can decide what we want to do. What we want to do, though, is make it very clear to the implementers exactly what's going on and what they need to do. So we'd set up a wiki, kind of like Quick's wiki, to make sure we indicate what the implementations are, people that are playing along, both on the server and the client side, as well as what is planned to be implemented for that particular version. Next slide. Discussion. Does this sound like something we would like to do? This was done in Quick, and it was very successful. I think it moved things along. Ecker.
Appropriate, but I implore the chairs not to have the implementation target be draft 09 plus PRs 17, 32, and 19. That draft numbers are cheap. I think we could afford to just generate new drafts when we need them. If we're really desperate, fine, but we're not. So
that's a point taken. I mean, the idea is that we can easily pump out new versions. It does make it easier, and it's much clearer to follow along. So definitely we can try to do that. Stephen?
Yeah, I really support this idea. I think we could doing it in the near future for some draft. I don't care what the revision number is, because it's kind of been quite a while with this spec since we've had interop like that, I think. So, well, we're do it soon, please.
I mean, this is really the crux of the matter, is that basically we'll set up a wiki and then people could submit PRs to add the server-side implementation with links to whatever they want and client-side and go from there. And I personally think that what we should be going for is the next version, the 09 version. I guess, Chris, is that was kind of your thinking as well?
I took a stab at the wiki based on what Quick has done, and there's a list of initial implementations, a pointer to a feature matrix, interop matrix similar to Quick. So assuming that works for folks, I would encourage you to please submit PRs to update the spreadsheet. Let's get the ball rolling.
All right. Does anybody not think this is a good idea? I really don't think so. So this brings us to the bottom of the hour. And that's it for our session. We only had 1 hour scheduled. So thank you very much. See you next time. And thanks, Chris, for taking notes.